King and country, and welcome back to the War Report. Tonight, I'd like to read from the book Untold Stories of World War II. One of the stories is called The Great Nazi Counterfeit Plot by Major George McNally of the British Forces. Counterfeit notes, they were made by counterfeiters and those artists that were able to forge notes, and they got better and better at it to the point where they made the British pound perfect, that the own British banking system, which many countries relied on and saved in times of need, it could destroy the country. And this was being done by a government against one government, actually against two governments, as they also tried to counterfeit the American dollar, but they could never quite get it right in the concentration camps. But they managed to make millions of British pounds that looked perfect, flawless. And they spread them throughout Europe, and they had agents carry them over in briefcases in about denominations of 100,000 pounds. That is English dollars. And now let's get into Major George McNally's experience of it. A few days after the surrender of Hitler's armies, an excited Allied counter-espionage officer in Austria telephoned my office in Frankfurt. A German captain handed over a lorry loaded with millions of pounds worth of English banknotes. Huge amounts of currency, he added, were floating about in the Enns River. Householders and Allied troops were busy fishing it out. At that time, my job was to protect Allied troops in Europe from the counterfeiting of currency, which always thrives during military invasions and occupations. This report, however, from Austria startled and puzzled me, so I immediately set off for the place where the German captain and his lorry had been taken. In 23 stout boxes, about the size of coffins, were bundles and bundles of Bank of England notes. A quick tally, helped by lists tacked inside the cover of each case, showed that it totaled to no less than 21 million pounds. It was impossible for me to determine, even under a powerful magnifying glass, whether the notes were genuine or not. I telephoned my British colleagues in Frankfurt, and shortly afterwards had a telephone call direct from the Bank of England. When I described the find, there was a long, drawn gasp at the end of the line. Soon, a representative of the bank arrived from London, a tall, angular, and reserved gentleman named P.J. Reeves. We took Reeves to the heavily guarded room where the treasure was deposited, and he began going from box to box, fluttering the notes through his fingers. Finally, he stopped and started silently into space. Then, for several seconds, he swore, slowly and methodically in a quiet voice, but with vehemence. "Sorry," he said at last, "but the people who made this stuff have cost us so much." And so Reeves, 3 Scotland Yard detectives, and I collaborated in piecing together the story of Operation Bernhard, the biggest hoax that one government had ever perpetrated on another. First, I was told that during 1943, an alarming number of counterfeit English banknotes had been finding their way to London from Zurich, Lisbon, Stockholm, and other neutral centers. They had become They had begun to come in batches of 100,000 pounds or more, and the quality of the fakes had been improving steadily. Soon it was clear to the bank's experts that the notes were being manufactured by highly skilled craftsmen and distributed by a remarkably efficient gang. Then the German spy was arrested in Edinburgh. The suitcase he carried was stuffed with banknotes, the finest forged money the Bank of England had ever seen. The bank now realized that it was up against the German government itself, and that the very credit of Britain might well be at stake. For decades, banks all over the world had been using banknote notes almost like gold. Frightened Europeans and Asiatics had hoarded them against bad days. Now hundreds of thousands of pounds of forged British money were circulating outside Britain. If doubt were cast on the integrity of these notes, the result might prove extremely dangerous to Britain and to the Allied cause, so the bank had to bow to the inevitable. With little background information, we began a search for the men and machinery behind the huge counterfeiting operation. Finding the machinery was, as it happened, not difficult. The German Hauptmann who had surrendered the boxes of banknotes told us he had received them from an SS officer whose lorry had broken down near the village of WW2. He had been instructed to dump them in the nearby lake. That was all the captain knew. We went to WW2 and discovered one of the underground networks of storage corridors and workshops that honeycombed the Alpine redoubt, where the Nazis had intended to make their last stand. There, in Gallery 16, a 200-foot-long tunnel stretching off a big shaft bored into a mountain, we found banknotes, presses, and other machinery. But no plates, no paper, no records. Now, said Reeves, we have to find the chaps who ran this place. Inquiries in WW2 revealed that all the men who had worked in a subterranean factory had been taken to the extermination camp at Ebensee, 40 miles away, a few days before the Germans surrendered. We got to Ebensee quickly, but every one of the forgers was gone. The commandant there had pretended to accept the order to gas 140 men, but had taken no action. When the camp was liberated by the Allies, the counterfeiters had simply walked out. Fortunately, the camp records have been kept with typical German precision. Even though the last mad days of the Reich, the names and birthplaces of the strange band were listed, then began a search which took us to the four corners of the former Nazi Empire. One by one, we rounded up more than 40 of the most important of the counterfeiters. Little by little, we checked and pierced together their sometimes almost incredible testimony. And then we struck oil from various of our witnesses. We learned that a Czech named Oskar Skala, a political prisoner of the Nazis, had been chief bookkeeper of the operation. We found him, with the help of the Czechoslovak police, peacefully selling beer in a little town near Pilsen. Skala was more than cooperative, a methodical man. He had kept in a tiny notebook a day-to-day description of the work of the forgers, the final pieces of the fantastic story of Operation Bernhard fell into place. Early in the war, Heinrich Himmler had created in his innermost headquarters Office 6-F-4, an organization whose aim was to corrupt the British economy by counterfeiting English banknotes on a large scale. The project really got into its stride when Major Bernhard Krüger came in as executive director in 1942. This Krüger was a young, resourceful Nazi who saw in the problems which were delaying 6-F-4 a fascinating challenge. One of the difficulties had been the recruiting of the highly skilled, specialized personnel needed for a big counterfeiting plant. The experts at the Reichsbank and the Reich printing office, most of them straight-laced old Prussian civil servants, rebelled at the idea of actually printing another nation's money, even in wartime. Krüger had a solution. A number of Germany's outstanding printing technicians were in concentration camps because of their racial origin. Such men could be put to work and be kept quiet. Bernhard Krüger rounded up these technicians and promised them preferential treatment for the rest of their lives, and had them transported to the Saschenhausen Concentration Camp at Oranienburg near Berlin. There, in an isolated compound, known as Block 19, surrounded by electric fences and picked guards from the notorious Death's Head or Totenkopf Brigade, sworn to absolute secrecy, Operation Bernhard got down to business. The most advanced banknote printing plants were set up. Plates were engraved with meticulous care. Germany's best press manufacturer interrupted war production to supply the necessary precision machinery. A paper concern, after many trials, reproduced the fine, light Bank of England paper with its elaborate watermarks. Office 6-4 sent experimental batches of the Bernhard product to the Gestapo representatives in German embassies and consulates in Turkey, Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden, with instructions to try them on the local banks. Most of the notes were accepted without question. Himmler was jubilant. Now, as the notes came off the presses, they were meticulously inspected and graded. Grade 1 notes, the best, were distributed by 6-F-4 for purchases in neutral countries and as operation money for the more important of Himmler's spies and saboteurs abroad. Grade 2, which had slight imperfection but were still excellent, forgeries, were distributed to Gestapo units in occupied countries to buy information and subsidize collaborators who liked to have Bank of England notes at hand in case anything went wrong. Grade 3 notes, still an extremely deceptive forgery, were accumulated and stored for an especially fantastic project, Himmler's. They were to be dumped on the British Isles from planes. Himmler's hope was that people all over the country would pick them up and try to use them, thus confronting the government and without causing an economic upset. Fortunately, by the time enough notes were available, the Luftwaffe had been driven from the air over Britain and the project was dropped. One of the outstanding victims of Krüger's Grade 1 money was the now famous Cicero, the Albanian professional spy Elysia Bazna, who was valet to the British ambassador in Ankara during the war, and who became, he thought, the highest paid spy in history when he received £300,000 from German intelligence for secrets he filched from the ambassador's safe. Another more typical victim was a Swiss businessman who accepted in good faith British notes worth about £60,000 from a Turkish bank. The pounds were accepted in turn by a Swiss bank and eventually worked their way through several other neutral countries to the Bank of England. There, Major Krüger's product was finally detected by an alert cashier. In some cases, however, Saschenhausen Grade 1 notes actually went from Germany to a neutral country, from there to Britain, back to another neutral country, and finally back to Germany, without detection at any point along the way. Even though Operation Bernhard flourished, Major Krüger was worried. His plant was producing 50,000 notes a month, and the total stipulated by Himmler would soon be reached. The Major therefore conspired with his foreman to slow down the presses and to condemn large quantities of first-class notes as faulty. "If we don't slow down," he said to his bookkeeper and principal lieutenant one day, "I will be sent to the front to fight, and you will all be shot. That would be a great pity." It was fortunate for the Bank of England that he felt like that. Several 100,000 Grade 1 notes which might have been circulated were secretly packed away in big wooden boxes at Krüger's orders. But now the tide of war was turning. Berlin was being bombed more heavily every day, and Saschenhausen was within the target area. Himmler wanted to shut down Operation Bernhard, but Krüger persuaded his chief to let him move the plant and men to the Austrian Alps. The Major argued that in case of a collapse, Office 6-F-4 could be extremely useful to good Nazis by providing foreign money and expertly forged credentials of every kind. The transfer from Saschenhausen took several months. It was April 1945 before Operation Bernhard was ready to set up its presses in Gallery 16 behind Redl-Ziff. By that time, Allied troops were already closing in on the redoubt. Late one afternoon, Major Krüger, in a fast Alfa Romeo sports car and accompanied by his striking blonde, roared into the concentration camp at the mouth of the Redl-Ziff cave. Hurriedly he gave orders from Himmler himself. Every trace of Operation Bernhard was to be obliterated. All records would be destroyed. Forged currency and unprinted banknotes, paper burnt, plates and dies sunk in nearby Lake Toplitz. All 140 technicians were to be taken to Ebensee concentration camp and killed. The Major, still composed and polite, apologized for not being able to supervise the details himself. He had, he said, urgent business elsewhere. The Alfa Romeo was loaded with genuine Bank of England and Swiss notes, acquired, we subsequently learned from his subordinates, through black market operations and occupied capitals. Its glove box was filled with excellently forged passports. The car streaked away in the direction of Switzerland. Master counterfeiter Krüger has never been heard of since, despite the efforts of half a dozen police forces to find him. For 3 days after the Major had departed, the SS officers and the prisoners of Operation Bernhard stoked a big incinerator with records and inferior counterfeits. A squad sank the printing plates deep in Lake Toplitz. At the last, these men could not bring themselves to destroy the finest of the forged notes. The hoard that Krüger had set aside to avoid the appearance of overproduction As one of the counterfeiters told us later, they were so beautiful. Coffin-sized boxes of them were loaded on lorries, and the drivers were ordered to bury them for later recovery. One of the lorry loads was that which was handed over to us by the German captain. Some simply disappeared. Others were dumped into the Enns River by frightened SS men who only wanted to get into civilian clothes and be on their way. In the turbulent Alpine stream, these boxes of notes were broken open by the rocks, and people from round about delightedly began fishing. Our investigation at an end, we made a tally of Operation Bernhard's total production. It was startling. According to Oscar Scala's notebook and the corroborating evidence of other Krüger workers, the major plant turned out almost 9 million Bank of England notes with a face value of approximately 140 million pounds. Notes worth 1.5 million pounds went to Turkey and the Near East. 3 million worth were distributed by 6-F-4 in France and the Low Countries. 7.5 million pounds paid German bills in Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, and Scandinavia. Another 37.5 million pounds escaped burning at Red Zif and was either fished out of the Enns River by Austrians, Russians, Americans, and British, or cashed by SS men. For a long while, Krüger masterpieces which had been salvaged and not surrendered kept turning up at British racecourses, in European black markets, even in New York banking houses. New 5-pound notes with a fine metallic thread drawn through them, and as counterproof as money could be at the time, replaced the old staved off. Replaced the old currency. By heroic effort, the bank rescued Britain's credit and staved off a desperate attempt to sabotage the Allied economy. But for the British and for Americans, Operation Bernhard was a near thing, and it could happen again. So what do you think of this story? Pretty scary stuff that Germany's government had aimed to ruin another country's economy, even if it was wartime. Actually, as mentioned before, they tried the American dollar notes as well, but just couldn't get it quite right. Later, these forgers still had these skills. Some went even or straight. Others enjoyed a high life of counterfeit money. There's even a movie about it, and I forget the title, but it's an amazing story. One of the strange and wonderful untold stories of World War II that gets you thinking. Let us know in the comments, again, what you think, or what you think could have prevented it. And like, share, and leave a comment. This is the War Report signing out. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for all notifications. We really appreciate it. War Report out.